Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest. I never thought a single act of kindness could unravel the carefully woven threads of my solitary life. At 39, I had settled into a rhythm that felt safe, predictable, almost comforting in its monotony. My days in the coastal town of Seabrook were a blur of work at the local art gallery, quiet evenings on my balcony overlooking the ocean, and the occasional sip of Chardonnay as I watched the waves crash against the shore, their rhythm a soothing lullaby to my restless heart. The spark of something new, something thrilling, had long since faded, buried beneath the weight of routine and the scars of past heartaches. That is, until the night Lucas, my enigmatic neighbor, stepped into my world in a way that set my senses ablaze. Lucas had lived in the beachfront cottage next to mine for nearly 4 years. A ruggedly handsome man in his mid-40s, he carried an air of quiet mystery that both intrigued and unnerved me. With his sun-kissed skin, tousled chestnut hair, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories, he was the kind of man who could make your breath catch without even trying. We'd exchanged polite smiles and small talk over the years, about the weather, the tides, the seagulls that squawked at dawn, but beyond that, he remained a tantalizing enigma. I knew he was a marine biologist, often out at sea for days, returning with a wind-swept glow and a loyal golden retriever named Finn who bounded around him with unbridled joy. Our little seaside community valued its privacy, and I'd always been content to keep my distance, guarding my heart behind walls I'd built brick by brick. Or so I thought. It all began on a crisp spring evening, the kind where the air carried the salty tang of the ocean and the sky burned with hues of coral and lavender as the sun dipped below the horizon. I'd just returned from a grueling day at the gallery, my mind a tangled mess of stress and exhaustion, my body aching from hours on my feet. The scent of blooming jasmine wafted through the air as I trudged up the sandy path to my cottage, my sandals kicking up grains of sand with each step. I sighed at the sight of my balcony lantern flickering erratically, its warm glow stuttering in the twilight, a small annoyance I'd been meaning to fix but kept putting off. As I fumbled with my keys, my tote bag slipping from my shoulder, a deep, velvety voice cut through the stillness, sending a shiver down my spine. "Looks like you could use a hand, Elise," Lucas called from the edge of my property, his silhouette framed against the fading light, hands tucked into the pockets of his faded denim jacket. His voice was a low, soothing rumble, laced with a warmth that made my pulse quicken. I turned, my breath catching as I met his gaze, those blue eyes glinting with a quiet intensity that made my skin tingle. "Oh, hey," I replied, forcing a tired smile, my fingers brushing a stray lock of auburn hair from my face, the ocean breeze teasing the hem of my flowy white sundress. "Just the usual chaos after a long day." He nodded, stepping closer, his presence commanding yet gentle, the scent of salt water and cedar clinging to him like a second skin. "I've noticed your lantern's been flickering," he said, his gaze flicking to the faulty light, then back to me, a flicker of something unspoken in his eyes. "I can take a look if you'd like." I hesitated, my heart thudding in my chest. It was such a small gesture, but the idea of letting someone, especially someone like Lucas with his magnetic aura, into my space felt like stepping onto uncharted waters. I'd spent years handling everything on my own, convincing myself I didn't need anyone. But the way he looked at me, with a quiet sincerity that made my defenses waver, gave me pause. "That would be really nice," I admitted, my voice softer than I intended, a flush creeping up my neck as I met his gaze. He flashed a small, knowing smile, the kind that made my stomach flutter, and walked over, pulling a small tool from his pocket with the ease of a man who knew his way around a challenge. As he worked, we fell into an easy conversation, the ocean waves a gentle backdrop to our words. For the first time, I found myself genuinely curious about him, my guarded heart cracking open just a sliver. He told me about his work, how he studied marine life, spending days on the open water, restoring coral reefs. I shared snippets of my life at the gallery, how I spent my days surrounded by art, but often felt like a bystander in my own story. "There," he said finally, stepping back as the lantern glowed steadily. casting a warm, golden light over us, illuminating the sharp lines of his jaw and the faint stubble that dusted his cheeks. "Should be good now." "That was fast," I said, genuinely impressed, my fingers brushing against the hem of my dress as I met his gaze, a spark of admiration flickering in my chest. "I would have spent hours fumbling with it before giving up." He chuckled, a low, husky sound that sent a shiver through me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sometimes it's just a loose connection," he said, his voice a soothing murmur. "Happens more often than you'd think." I thanked him, expecting him to head back to his cottage, but instead, he leaned against the railing of my balcony, his broad shoulders relaxed, his gaze drifting to the ocean, the moonlight reflecting in his eyes like a secret waiting to be shared. "Funny thing," he said after a moment, his voice softer now, a hint of vulnerability in his tone that made my heart skip a beat. "When I first moved here, I thought this place would just be a pit stop. Never thought I'd stay." I tilted my head, intrigued, my fingers tightening around the strap of my tote bag. "And now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, the air between us charged with a quiet tension. He exhaled, his breath visible in the cool night air, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin flush. "Now, I don't know," he said, a small, wistful smile tugging at his lips. "Some places, and some people, have a way of growing on you." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, a quiet invitation that made my pulse race, a heat pooling in my core as I stood there, the ocean breeze teasing my hair, the lantern's glow casting soft shadows across his face. That night, as I watched him walk back to his cottage, Finn trotting happily at his side, I found myself glancing at his house more than once, a restless energy stirring within me. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of something I thought I'd lost. Hope, longing, a whisper of something more. Over the next few weeks, Lucas and I crossed paths more often, each encounter peeling back another layer of the walls I'd built around my heart. It started with casual waves as I passed his cottage, then evolved into lingering conversations on the beach at sunset, the sand cool beneath our feet, the waves whispering secrets as we talked. And then, one evening, it became something more. It had been a brutal day at the gallery. A client had backed out of a major exhibition, leaving me drained and on edge. By the time I got home, all I wanted was to collapse into solitude, to drown my frustrations in a glass of wine and the sound of the ocean. But as I stepped out of my car, my heels sinking into the sandy path, Lucas was there, leaning against his Jeep, Finn wagging his tail beside him, his blue eyes studying me with a quiet intensity that made my breath catch. "Rough day, Elise?" he asked, his voice a low, soothing rumble that seemed to wrap around me, easing the tension in my shoulders. I sighed, running a hand through my hair, the ocean breeze teasing the hem of my skirt. "You could say that," I replied, my voice heavy with exhaustion, my defenses crumbling under the weight of his gaze. He pushed off the Jeep, closing the distance between us, his presence a comforting warmth in the cool evening air. "Come on," he said, motioning toward his cottage, his tone gentle but firm, a quiet command that made my heart race. "You need a break." I hesitated, my mind screaming to retreat, to cling to my solitude, but the way he looked at me with a quiet understanding that made me feel seen, made me follow. His cottage was a warm haven, the scent of sandalwood and sea salt lingering in the air, the soft glow of a lamp casting golden shadows across the room. He poured me a glass of wine without asking, as if he could sense exactly what I needed, the deep red liquid catching the light as he handed it to me, his fingers brushing mine for a fleeting moment, sending a jolt of electricity through me. We sat on his weathered leather couch, Finn resting his head on my knee, his warmth a grounding contrast to the storm of emotions swirling inside me. For the first time in a long time, I let my guard down, the wine loosening my tongue as we talked about everything and nothing. Memories, regrets, the dreams we'd buried beneath the weight of life. As the evening stretched on, something shifted between us. A subtle heat that simmered beneath the surface, a quiet tension that made my skin tingle. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was a slow burn, like the first embers of a fire catching in the dark. At some point, I leaned back against the couch, exhaustion washing over me, my body sinking into the cushions, my sundress riding up slightly to reveal the smooth expanse of my thigh. Lucas didn't say anything, didn't try to fill the silence, but his gaze lingered on me, a smoldering intensity in his blue eyes that made my breath hitch. He reached over, his hand covering mine, his touch warm and grounding, a quiet anchor in the storm of my emotions. "You're not alone, you know," he said softly, his voice a low, husky murmur that sent a shiver down my spine, a heat pooling in my core as his thumb brushed against my skin, a fleeting caress that made my heart race. For the first time in years, I believed him, a wave of warmth spreading through me, a quiet longing that I hadn't let myself feel in so long. That night, as I walked back to my cottage, the ocean waves a gentle lullaby in the background, I felt a spark I hadn't felt in years, a flicker of hope, a whisper of connection, a promise of something more. The days that followed felt different, charged with a quiet understanding that lingered in the air between us. It wasn't just the stolen glances as I passed his cottage, or the way my heart raced when I heard Finn barking in the distance. It was a shift deep within me, a restless energy that made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. I'd always prided myself on my independence, my ability to handle everything on my own, but as I sat on my balcony one morning, sipping coffee as the sun rose over the ocean, I found myself thinking about Lucas in a way I hadn't before. It wasn't just his kindness or the way he listened, it was the way he saw me, the real me, peeling back the layers I'd hidden beneath years of solitude, his gaze a mirror to the vulnerability I'd tried so hard to bury. The following Saturday, everything changed. I'd just finished repotting some plants on my balcony, my hands dusted with soil, my hair a messy bun atop my head, when I heard a knock at my door. I opened it to find Lucas standing there, Finn by his side, his blue eyes glinting with a quiet intensity that made my breath catch. "Got a minute, Elise?" he asked, his tone casual, but there was a spark in his gaze, a quiet invitation that made my pulse quicken. "Of course," I replied, stepping aside to let him in, my heart racing as I brushed a smudge of dirt from my cheek. Suddenly hyper-aware of the way my tank top clung to my curves, the ocean breeze teasing my hair. He had a way of making everything feel effortless, natural, a quiet confidence that put me at ease even as my nerves buzzed with anticipation. "I was thinking," he began, his voice a low, velvety murmur as he leaned against my kitchen counter, his broad shoulders relaxed, his gaze locking onto mine with a smoldering intensity that made my skin flush. "There's a spot I've been wanting to explore, a secluded cove about an hour's walk from here. Thought it might be nice to have some company." I raised an eyebrow, a playful smile tugging at my lips, my fingers brushing against the edge of my tank top as I met his gaze. "You want me to go exploring with you?" I teased, my voice lighter than I felt, a quiet challenge in my tone. "I don't even own proper hiking shoes." He laughed, a deep husky sound that sent a shiver through me, his eyes crinkling at the corners, a smoldering warmth in his gaze that made my breath hitch. "It's not a tough walk," he said, his voice a soothing murmur, a quiet promise in his tone. "Just a couple of hours by the water. Besides, it's not about the shoes. It's about getting out there, feeling the ocean breeze, letting go for a while." I hesitated, my mind screaming to retreat, to cling to my solitude, but the way he looked at me, with a quiet longing that mirrored my own, made me want to say yes. "All right," I said finally, surprising myself, a flush creeping up my neck as I met his gaze. "I'll go, but don't expect me to keep up with you." He smiled, a slow, smoldering grin that made my heart race, a quiet promise in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. "Deal," he said, his voice a low, velvety murmur that seemed to wrap around me, pulling me closer despite my resistance. The next morning we set out, the air crisp and salty, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the ocean. The path to the cove wound through a stretch of coastline, the waves crashing against the rocks below, the scent of salt water and wildflowers filling the air. Finn bounded ahead, chasing seagulls, while Lucas walked at a steady pace, his presence a comforting warmth beside me. With each step, I felt the weight of my stress lifting, the ocean breeze a soothing balm to my restless heart. We talked about life, about the things we'd never shared before, dreams we'd buried, regrets we'd carried, the quiet hopes we'd kept hidden. It felt so natural, so effortless, a side of me I'd forgotten existed, a part of me that could savor the simple beauty of a moment without overthinking it. About halfway to the cove, we stopped at a secluded spot where the cliffs gave way to a breathtaking view of the ocean, the water shimmering like a sheet of glass, the horizon stretching out endlessly before us. We sat on a smooth rock, the sun warming our skin, Finn lying contentedly at our feet, the waves a gentle lullaby in the background. "You know," Lucas said, breaking the silence, his voice a low, husky murmur that sent a shiver through me, his gaze softening as he looked at me, a quiet vulnerability in his eyes that made my heart ache. I used to come out here a lot when I first moved to Seabrook. Didn't have many friends, just needed the solitude. But after a while, I realized something. I didn't want to be alone anymore. I turned to him, surprised by the raw honesty in his voice, a wave of warmth spreading through me as I met his gaze, a quiet longing in my chest that mirrored his own. "I didn't know that about you," I said softly, my voice trembling, my fingers brushing against the rock as I leaned closer, the space between us charged with a quiet heat. He shrugged, a small, wistful smile tugging at his lips, his blue eyes glinting with a smoldering intensity that made my breath hitch. "I don't talk about it much," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur that seemed to caress my name. "But I think it's important to let people in, even if it's just a little bit." I nodded slowly, his words sinking in, a wave of emotion crashing over me as I sat there, the ocean stretching out before us, endless and open, a mirror to the possibilities I'd been too afraid to see. In that moment, I realized how wrong I'd been to close myself off, to convince myself that I was better off alone. Lucas's presence was more than just comforting. It was liberating, a quiet anchor in the storm of my emotions, a reminder that I didn't have to carry everything on my own. As we made our way back to our cottages, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of coral and gold, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the time spent with Lucas, but for the lesson he'd unknowingly taught me. It was okay to open up, to lean on someone, to let someone in. The drive back was quiet but comfortable, the ocean a gentle backdrop to the unspoken bond forming between us. When we reached my cottage, I turned to him, a smile tugging at my lips, a quiet warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. "Thanks for today," I said, my voice softer than usual, a quiet vulnerability in my tone as I met his gaze, a smoldering intensity in my eyes that mirrored his own. He met my gaze, his blue eyes steady and warm, a quiet promise in his expression that made my heart race. "Anytime, Elise," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur that sent a shiver down my spine, a heat pooling in my core as he stepped closer, the space between us charged with a quiet tension. "You're not alone, remember?" Nay, and just like that, something inside me clicked. The walls I'd spent years building crumbling in the face of his quiet sincerity. A wave of warmth spreading through me as I stood there, the ocean waves a gentle lullaby in the background, a promise of something new, something beautiful, waiting to bloom.